It was a quiet Sunday morning when David found himself rummaging through the kitchen drawer, searching for the takeout menu for their favorite diner. His wife, Linda, was upstairs, humming softly while tidying their bedroom. The sound of her contentment echoed through the house, but something wasn't sitting right with him. David's hand brushed against an unfamiliar envelope buried under old receipts and spare keys. The handwriting on the front was elegant, delicate, a style he didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. Inside was a neatly folded letter, but it wasn't addressed to him. "Can't wait to see you again this weekend. Counting the days until I'm in your arms." The words burned his eyes. They weren't meant for a husband, at least not this one. His heart pounded in his chest as he reread the letter, his mind spinning. He could feel the warmth drain from his face. Linda had always been meticulous, careful about keeping the house in order. How could she have missed something like this? Or had she grown careless? David folded the letter and placed it back where he found it, his hands trembling. For a moment, he thought about confronting her immediately. But no, he needed to understand what he was dealing with first. He couldn't charge into this blindly. "Linda," he called out, steadying his voice. "Do you remember where the takeout menu is?" Her response came quickly, cheerful and unsuspecting. "Check the drawer next to the fridge. Should be there." David stared at the envelope for another moment before closing the drawer quietly. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to smile as Linda came downstairs, holding a pile of laundry. She looked radiant, her face flushed from the effort of cleaning. "What's that look for?" she asked playfully, nudging him. "Oh, nothing," David said, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. "Just thinking about dinner." Linda chuckled and walked past him, her scent lingering in the air. For the first time in their marriage, David felt a hollow space grow between them, one filled with doubts, questions, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. As Linda disappeared into the living room, David's resolve hardened. He needed answers, but not from her, not yet. He would uncover the truth, piece by piece, until there was no denying it. Only then would he decide what to do next. David couldn't sleep that night. The letter's words replayed in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. Linda lay beside him, her breathing soft and even, completely at peace. But to David, the warmth of her presence now felt like a facade. The next morning, Linda left early for work, her usual routine. David sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and staring at the spot where he'd found the letter. His thoughts raced. Who could it be? When had it started? Was it someone he knew? Determined to take action, David decided to check Linda's phone. He knew her passcode. Years of trust had made it easy for them to share everything. But her phone wasn't on the kitchen counter, where she usually left it. That struck him as odd. She never took it to work. Later that day, David called his old friend and neighbor, Tom. Tom was the kind of man who could be both a good listener and a reliable ally in a crisis. "Hey, Tom," David said, trying to sound casual. "You busy? I could use some help with something." Tom picked up on the serious undertone immediately. "I'm here. What's going on?" David hesitated. Saying it out loud felt like admitting it was real. I think Linda might be hiding something. Something big." Tom came over that afternoon, and David explained everything. The letter, her recent odd behavior, and the missing phone. Tom listened without interruption, then leaned back in his chair. "David, you need more than just a letter to figure this out," Tom said firmly. "If she's hiding something, she's bound to slip up eventually. You just have to watch closely." They devised a plan. David would start tracking her patterns, where she went, how long she stayed out, and whether anything seemed out of place. He hated the idea of spying on his wife, but he hated the idea of living a lie even more. The next evening, Linda told him she was meeting some colleagues for dinner, a claim she had made a few times in the past month. Normally, David wouldn't have thought twice about it, but now every word out of her mouth felt like a puzzle piece begging to be examined. "Have fun," David said, smiling as if everything was normal. As soon as Linda left, David grabbed his coat and keys. Tom had parked his car a few blocks away, ready to help him tail her. David slid into the passenger seat, his heart pounding. "Ready?"
Tom asked.
David nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's do this." They followed Linda's car at a safe distance, weaving through familiar streets until she turned into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit cafe. David and Tom parked farther down the street and watched as Linda stepped out of her car. A man was waiting for her. He stood by the entrance, smiling warmly as Linda approached. They exchanged a brief hug, too friendly, too intimate for David's comfort. "That him?" Tom asked quietly, his voice filled with unspoken tension. David's fists clenched. "I don't know who he is, but I'm going to find out." Inside, David's world felt like it was shattering. Yet, deep down, a flicker of determination burned brighter. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. This was just the beginning of uncovering the truth. David spent the rest of the evening in a daze. Watching Linda and the unknown man disappear into the cafe left a knot in his stomach that he couldn't untangle. Tom had tried to keep him grounded, but the sheer weight of it all was suffocating. When Linda returned home later that night, she seemed calm, even cheerful. "Dinner went well," she said, placing her bag on the kitchen counter. "We're thinking of doing a team-building retreat next month. Should be fun." David forced a smile. "That sounds great. Where's the retreat?" "Oh, it's still up in the air. Probably somewhere close." She waved the question off and headed upstairs to shower. As the water ran, David stood in the kitchen, staring at her bag. He hesitated, battling with himself. Finally, he reached for it. Inside, her phone sat tucked into a side pocket. Unlocking it, he quickly scrolled through her messages. Most were mundane, work chats, reminders, and family group updates. But then he saw a thread labeled Mark. The messages were subtle, but not subtle enough to miss their meaning. "Tonight was perfect. I can't wait until we don't have to sneak around anymore." David's chest tightened. His thumb hovered over the screen as his pulse quickened. He wanted to read more, but he heard the water stop. Quickly, he placed the phone back in her bag and walked to the living room, pretending to scroll through his own phone. Linda appeared moments later, her hair wrapped in a towel. "You look deep in thought," she said, sitting beside him. "Just work stuff," David replied. His voice felt hollow, but Linda didn't seem to notice. The next day, David decided to dig deeper. He called Tom again. "She's seeing someone named Mark," David said bluntly. Tom sighed on the other end. "Do you know who he is?" "Anything about him?" "No," David admitted. "But I'll find out." He was at the cafe. "Maybe I can ask around there." Later that afternoon, David went to the cafe alone. The barista, a young woman with kind eyes, seemed approachable. "Excuse me," David said, clearing his throat. "I was here the other night and saw a man meeting someone. I think his name might be Mark. Do you know him?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Mark comes here a lot. I think he's a real estate agent. He's always meeting people here, clients, friends." "Why do you ask?" David forced a chuckle. "Oh, no reason. Just thought he looked familiar." Leaving the cafe, David had more questions than answers. A real estate agent? How had Linda even met him? That night, David confronted Linda, not with accusations, but with questions. "You've been working a lot lately," he said over dinner, trying to sound casual. "Everything okay?" Linda barely glanced up. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "I don't know. Just seems like you've been preoccupied." She smiled faintly. "Work's been busy, that's all. Nothing to worry about." But David couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding more. Her demeanor was so convincing it made him question himself. As she cleared the plates, David made a silent vow. He would figure out who Mark really was and why Linda thought he was worth risking everything. For now, he played along, but the storm brewing inside him grew stronger with each passing day. David spent the next few days walking a fine line between maintaining appearances and unraveling the truth. He had learned enough to know the affair wasn't a passing whim. This Mark was significant. But the why, when, and how were questions still haunting him. One evening, Linda left the house again, claiming she had a late meeting. David barely reacted, nodding with practiced ease. The moment she drove off, he texted Tom. "She's out again. I need your help." Minutes later, Tom pulled up outside the house. "Where to this time?" he asked as David slid into the passenger seat. "Let's start with the cafe," David replied, his jaw tight. When they arrived, Mark's car, a sleek black sedan, was parked in the same spot as before. David recognized it immediately. "Wait here," David said. Tom nodded, but his concern was palpable. "Be careful." David stepped into the cafe, scanning the room. It was quieter than usual, the murmur of conversations filling the space. At a corner table, he spotted them, Linda and Mark, leaning close, their expressions animated. They looked comfortable, like a couple who had done this many times before. David clenched his fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. Instead, he ordered a coffee and sat at a table near the window, far enough to avoid suspicion but close enough to observe. Their conversation was lively, punctuated by laughter. At one point, Mark reached across the table, briefly touching Linda's hand. The gesture was fleeting but intimate enough to make David's stomach churn. After about an hour, they left together. David quickly paid for his coffee and followed them outside. Tom, waiting in the car, watched as they got into Mark's sedan and drove off. "Let's go," David said, jumping back into Tom's car. They tailed Mark's car through town until it stopped at a quiet suburban neighborhood. David watched as Linda and Mark entered a modest house together. Tom broke the silence. "What now?" David stared at the house, his mind racing. "I need to know what's in there. I need proof." Tom frowned. "David, this could get messy." "Are you sure?" But David didn't respond. His focus was on the house, on the truth, just beyond those walls. The next day, David decided to take a bolder step. Using the barista's tip about Mark being a real estate agent, he found his professional profile online. There, he saw a picture of Mark smiling in front of a sold property. It confirmed everything. But there was something else, a photo of Mark at a company event with a woman by his side. She wasn't Linda. David's pulse quickened. Was Mark married too? He scrolled through more photos, piecing together a narrative. Mark was not only married, but seemed to lead a picture-perfect family life. It was a stunning twist David hadn't expected. That evening, when Linda returned home, David felt a surge of resolve. The lies were piling up, and it wasn't just Linda's deceit he was dealing with. Mark's secret life added a new layer to the betrayal. David sat in the living room, his face unreadable. Linda walked in, pausing when she saw him sitting there, waiting. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but guarded. David simply looked at her. "We need to talk." For the first time in weeks, he saw something flicker in her expression. Unease, perhaps even fear. But Linda quickly masked it with a smile. "Of course. What's on your mind?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, wondering how much more she could lie to his face. The truth was beginning to surface, and David was ready to confront it, no matter the cost. Linda sat across from David, her smile faltering under his unyielding gaze. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with forced casualness. David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I know about Mark." Her face blanched for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. "Mark? Who's Mark?" she asked, feigning confusion. David's patience snapped. "Don't do that, Linda. Don't insult me. I saw you with him, at the cafe, at his house. I know you've been lying to me." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders slumped slightly, and her eyes darted away. "It's not what you think," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. David let out a bitter laugh. "Then why don't you tell me what it is? Help me understand why my wife is sneaking around with another man." Linda hesitated, the tension in the room growing unbearable. "Mark, he's just someone I talk to. That's all." "Someone you talk to?" David's voice was sharp. "I saw the messages, Linda. I saw the way you looked at him. That's not just talking." She looked down at her hands, fiddling with her wedding ring. It started a few months ago, she admitted. I wasn't happy, David. I felt invisible. And then Mark came along and he listened. He made me feel like I mattered. David felt a surge of anger. So, instead of coming to me, you decided to find someone else? You think that justifies lying to my face? Sneaking around behind my back? I didn't mean for it to happen, Linda said, her voice breaking. It just did. David stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. And what about him? Does his wife know what he's doing? Linda's head snapped up. His wife. David turned to face her, his expression cold. Yes, his wife. Did you know Mark is married? Or did he conveniently leave that out while he was making you feel special? Linda's eyes widened in shock. I didn't know. David laughed bitterly. Of course you didn't. You were too busy playing into his lies to question anything. Tears welled up in Linda's eyes, but David felt no sympathy. He had spent weeks questioning his own sanity, doubting himself, while she had been weaving a web of deceit. I need time to think, David said finally, his voice firm. I can't even look at you right now. Linda reached out, but he stepped back. David, please. Don't, he interrupted, his voice cold. You made your choices, Linda. Now you'll have to live with the consequences. He grabbed his coat and walked out, the door slamming behind him. As he got into his car, David's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, but he also felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. For the first time in weeks, David felt a spark of clarity. This wasn't just about Linda's infidelity. It was about rebuilding his life, on his terms, without the lies and deceit that had poisoned their marriage. David drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the city lights blurring past him as his mind raced. The revelation of Linda's affair had shattered the foundation of his life, but the discovery of Mark's duplicity added another layer to the betrayal. It wasn't just his marriage at stake now. It was a web of lies that ensnared two families. Eventually, he pulled into the parking lot of a quiet park. The cold night air bit at his skin as he stepped out of the car, but the stillness around him was oddly comforting. He sat on a bench, staring at the empty playground, and let his thoughts settle. What was his next move? Confronting Linda had given him some answers, but not nearly enough. If Mark had a wife, didn't she deserve to know the truth too? The thought lingered as David pulled out his phone and opened the real estate company's website again. He scrolled through Mark's profile, landing on the group photo of him with his wife and colleagues. Her name was listed in the caption, Rachel. With a deep breath, David made his decision. He needed to speak to Rachel, not out of spite but because she had a right to know what was happening in her own marriage. The next morning, David called Tom and explained his plan. Are you sure about this? Tom asked cautiously. David nodded, resolute. She deserves to know. If the roles were reversed, I'd want someone to tell me. Using the information from Mark's profile, David found Rachel's social media. Her posts painted a picture of a happy family life, photos of their kids, vacations, and anniversary celebrations. The stark contrast between her online world and the reality Mark had created was heartbreaking. David hesitated before sending her a message. Hi, Rachel. My name is David, and I need to speak with you about something important regarding your husband, Mark. It's not easy for me to reach out like this, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. Please let me know if you're willing to talk. He pressed send and waited, his heart pounding. Hours later, his phone buzzed. Rachel had replied, I don't know who you are or what this is about, but I'm listening. What do you need to tell me? David arranged to meet Rachel at a local cafe. When she arrived, he immediately recognized her from the photos. She looked kind but tired, as if carrying a weight she couldn't explain. I'm sorry to bring this to you, David began, his voice low. But I thought you should know. Your husband, Mark, has been seeing my wife, Linda. Rachel's face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. What are you saying? Are you sure? David nodded solemnly. I've seen them together. I've read messages between them. I know this is a lot to take in, but I didn't want to keep this from you. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Thank you for telling me.
I,
I've had my suspicions, but I didn't want to believe it. They talked for a while longer, sharing what they knew and piecing together the timeline of the affair. For Rachel, the betrayal was a devastating blow, but it also gave her clarity. What are you going to do? David asked gently. Rachel took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I'm going to confront him. He owes me an explanation and so much more. As they parted ways, David felt an odd sense of closure. He hadn't fixed anything, but he had done the right thing. The truth was out now, and it was up to each of them to decide how to move forward. That night, David returned home to find Linda sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I told Rachel about Mark." Linda's face crumpled, and for the first time, she seemed truly shaken. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," David said firmly. "Because the truth matters, Linda. Even if it hurts, it matters." As he walked past her, heading to the spare bedroom, Linda's quiet sobs filled the silence. But David didn't stop. He had his own healing to do, and for now he needed distance from Linda, from the pain, and from the life he thought he knew. The days that followed were a blur of silence and strained exchanges. Linda stayed mostly in the bedroom, leaving David to occupy the rest of the house. The tension between them was palpable, but neither made a move to bridge the growing chasm. Meanwhile, Rachel reached out to David again. "I confronted Mark," her message began. "He didn't deny it. Said he thought I'd never find out. I've told him to leave the house. I need time to figure out what to do next." David felt a mix of emotions as he read her words: sympathy, anger, and an odd sense of solidarity. Rachel's decision to take immediate action stood in stark contrast to Linda's avoidance. One evening, David sat down with a notebook. He needed clarity, a way to untangle the mess his life had become. Writing helped him organize his thoughts. Linda's betrayal. Can I forgive her? Mark and Rachel. Their fallout isn't mine to solve, but I can't ignore it either. What do I want? A future free of lies. The last line stuck with him. What did a future without lies look like? Could it include Linda? The next day, Linda finally broke the silence. "David," she said softly, standing in the kitchen doorway. "We need to talk." He looked up from his coffee, his face unreadable. "I'm listening." She took a hesitant step forward. "I've been thinking a lot. About us, about what I've done. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to explain." David gestured for her to sit. He remained silent, letting her speak. "I made a horrible mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "I was selfish. I let my insecurities and unhappiness blind me to everything good we had. And instead of facing it, I ran to someone else. It was wrong. All of it." David studied her carefully. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me how you felt?" Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. Maybe I was afraid you wouldn't understand. Maybe I didn't know how to face it myself. But that doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't," David said, his tone firm but calm. "You broke my trust, Linda. And trust isn't something you can just piece back together with an apology." "I know," she whispered. "But I want to try, if you'll let me. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." David leaned back in his chair, his emotions a storm inside him. "I don't know if that's possible, Linda. I need time. And I need to figure out what's best for me, for both of us." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. Just please don't shut me out completely." That evening, David met with Tom. "She wants to fix things," David said, staring into his drink. "But I don't know if I can ever see her the same way again." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to decide now. Take your time. This is your life, David. Don't rush into anything just because it's what she wants." Weeks turned into months, and slowly, David began rebuilding his life. He focused on himself, his work, his hobbies, and reconnecting with old friends. Linda moved out temporarily, giving them both the space they needed. One day, Rachel reached out again. "I filed for divorce," she said. "It was hard, but I feel like I can finally breathe again. Thank you for giving me the courage to face it." David congratulated her, feeling a sense of closure for them both. As for Linda, she continued to reach out, sending messages and letters, each one expressing her remorse and her desire to rebuild their life together. But David remained cautious. Trust, he realized, was not easily earned, and forgiveness didn't come with guarantees. In the end, David stood at a crossroads, unsure of where the path ahead would lead. But one thing was clear: his future would be built on truth, no matter how painful, and on a foundation he could trust, whether that included Linda or not. If you like this story, kindly like, share, and comment.